Rome is burning. A family stumbles into the street as flames tear through the roof above them. By sunrise, a lifetime of wealth could be gone. They have saved almost nothing. A wooden chest, a household shrine, a handful of coins. Then men appear through the smoke, carrying buckets, ladders, and axes. For one brief moment, the owner believes his home can still be saved. But the men stop. A wealthy Roman, in a white toga, walks toward the burning building. He does not ask whether the family is safe. He studies the fire and makes an offer. Sell now, sell cheaply, or let the flames decide what the property will be worth by morning. The buyer is Marcus Licinius Crassus. He would become the richest man in the Roman Republic. According to the story repeated for centuries, Crassus brought his own private fire brigade to burning homes. If the owner sold, his men fought the flames. If the owner refused, they watched everything burn. It is one of history's most ruthless stories about money. It is also almost too perfect. Because the surviving ancient source does not actually say that happened. Plutarch tells us that Crassus bought burning buildings, neighboring properties, and the fear of owners who believed they might lose everything. But he never describes firefighters waiting for a signature. The famous version may be a legend. The documented reality was quieter, more systematic, and perhaps more disturbing. Crassus did not need to start the fire. He only needed a city where disaster was common. Protection was weak, and desperate owners had no time to bargain. Then he needed cash, skilled labor, and the patience to wait for panic to lower the price. He did not merely buy property, he bought panic. Rome in the 1st century BC was rich, crowded, and dangerously flammable. Fire burned inside narrow streets and tightly packed buildings. One fallen oil lamp could threaten an entire block. Owners had no modern fire department and no insurance promising to rebuild. A house valuable at sunset could become nearly worthless before midnight because its owner could no longer afford to wait. Crassus could. That ability to wait while someone else was desperate became one foundation of his fortune. Crassus had learned this lesson long before he dominated Roman real estate. As a young man, political violence killed his father and one of his brothers. Crassus fled to Spain and hid in a cave until the political tide turned. He returned with the general Sulla, who captured Rome and turned political murder into a market. Names appeared on prescription lists. Their owners could be killed, and their property confiscated and sold. Crassus bought. This was the pattern that defined him. Where others saw chaos, he saw mispriced assets. Where others saw ruined lives, he saw sellers with no bargaining power. Plutarch summarized the origin of his fortune in one brutal idea. Crassus made public calamities his source of revenue, especially fire and war. Disaster did not simply destroy wealth. It transferred wealth from people who needed money now to people who could afford to wait. Crassus made sure he was always on the second side of that trade. He acquired more than 500 enslaved architects and builders. They could inspect, repair, and reconstruct damaged property. This was not just a household. It was a vertically integrated property empire. Crassus controlled the capital, the labor, and the rebuilding costs. Other buyers saw smoke, cracked walls, and months of expensive work. Crassus saw land, location, and a repair bill he already controlled. The fire created the discount. His enslaved workforce turned the discount into profit. Plutarch says Crassus bought buildings that were already burning. He also bought the houses beside them. That detail reveals how calculating the system was. A neighboring house might still be standing, but its owner could see sparks crossing the street and smoke gathering beneath the roof. The property had not yet been destroyed. Its value was already collapsing. The owner faced a cruel decision. Accept a small but certain payment now, or gamble the family's wealth on the direction of the wind. Crassus stood on the other side with cash, workers, and time. He was buying risk from people who could no longer afford to carry it. Each purchase expanded the machine. Property produced rent, rent produced cash, and cash allowed Crassus to move faster when the next crisis arrived. The disasters came from the city. The liquidity came from Crassus. This is why the fire brigade story became so believable. It captures the moral truth of his business, even if the dramatic details are not supported by the surviving evidence. Crassus did not need men to demand a signature beside the flames. The market was already applying the pressure. A terrified owner beneath a burning roof, no insurance, and one buyer wealthy enough to name the price. That is not really a story about firefighting. It is a story about bargaining power. Decades later, Marcus Ignatius Rufus really did use his own men to fight fires. Perhaps centuries of retelling fused Rome's ruthless property buyer with its private firefighter. The result offered one unforgettable choice: sell or burn. But the documented version explains Crassus's wealth better. He did not become rich through one clever trick. He built a machine designed to profit whenever society failed to protect the vulnerable. He owned mines and agricultural land, lent money, and cultivated clients, debtors, and political allies. Wealth created influence, and influence created new opportunities to accumulate wealth. His balance sheet was not just property, it was obligation. The scale of his fortune astonished Rome. Plutarch says Crassus grew from fewer than 300 talents to 7,100, roughly 200 metric tons of silver, worth hundreds of millions of dollars in raw metal alone. Pliny the Elder separately valued his landed property at 200 million sesterces, and one modern estimate compares Crassus's fortune to roughly an entire year of Roman state revenue. Even that comparison misses the point. Crassus was not merely rich enough to live in luxury. He was rich enough to finance power. He reportedly believed that no man could call himself rich unless he could support an army from his own resources. His fortune placed him beside Pompey and Julius Caesar among Rome's most powerful men. But his rivals possessed something he did not: military glory. Crassus could buy property, labor, and loyalty. He could not buy Rome's admiration at a distressed price. His greed had changed shape. Money had become influence, and influence had become a hunger for the one asset his rivals possessed, and he did not: a great military victory. So Crassus marched east. In 53 BC, his army was destroyed by a smaller Parthian force near Carrhae. His son was killed. The campaign collapsed, and Crassus died after negotiations with the Parthians broke down. Then history created one final image. Cassius Dio says that some claimed the Parthians poured molten gold into Crassus's mouth after his death. A man who could never possess enough gold was finally forced to consume it. The story is a legend, not a secure fact. But legends survive when they express what people believe a life meant. Crassus spent decades turning fear into leverage. He bought assets from people who had no time. He controlled the labor that restored their value. He converted property into political power. And when ordinary wealth no longer satisfied him, he risked an army to acquire glory. That is why Marcus Crassus belongs on Money Stories. Not because he may have owned a cruel fire brigade, but because he understood one of the darkest truths about wealth. The best bargains often appear when someone else has no choice. Crassus built his fortune in the space between value and desperation. He had the cash to survive a crisis, the labor to profit from the recovery, and the calculation to let fear negotiate for him. He did not need to control the flames. He only needed to stand where the price was falling. The fire destroyed the buildings. Fear transferred the ownership. And the richest man in Rome became proof that, in the right hands, even disaster could become an investment. Subscribe to Money Stories for more true stories about wealth, power, and the price people paid for both.